Yeah, a lot of, with that intro, I don't want to take too much time commenting on it, but there was some good stuff there. With that puzzle, there's a huge difference between trying to make a puzzle when you're looking at the cover of the box and you know what it looks like, versus just having a bunch of puzzle pieces and guessing maybe these will fit together. I'm hoping they fit together. Some of them should. If you've intimately stared at the master picture for a very long time, you're going to start to remember, like, okay, this is what we're looking at. Like, I remember, so Mark Herpecki, he's a big puzzle guy. Anytime I've been on vacation with him, he's got a big puzzle that he works on throughout the week. And one time he had this Star Wars puzzle, with all kinds of characters from the movies. And, you have the box flipped up, you're looking at the picture, you're looking at your pieces, you're building. I tend to be pretty poor at puzzle construction. But I remember I had my moment where I saw a piece and called it out loud before I picked it up and put it in. And I said, that's Han Solo's belt buckle. And I picked it up and I put it in. And the only reason for that is because I had stared at that box for however long we were on vacation for, that it's like, yep, there's going to be a moment. And so what Nate is talking about, don't think of this series as Han Solo's belt buckle. Think of this as time to get familiar with the big picture. Because as you get acquainted with that, then some of the details will start to fill in for you over time. And yeah, we want to develop, we want to grow. That's the whole point. You use the analogy of you're not going to just arbitrarily take on some project that maybe risks your safety. Maybe you will. But yeah, this past week, some of you will laugh at me. I'm sure Brian would. I had to strip a wire. I don't strip a lot of wires. I'm trying to do it. I'm like, this doesn't feel like it's going the right way. And my brother's looking. He's like, yeah, it shouldn't be that hard. You're not doing something right. And then he looks and he says, yep, you got to flip that the other way around. The angles are working against you. And sure enough, it works smooth once you're using the tool correctly. But until you're using the tool correctly, you're going to struggle. And there's nothing wrong with struggling in order to learn and develop. And so that's what this is about. This evening I was checking out some verses. Obviously there's quite a few of them that we have to get into. Daniel chapter 7, verse 28 says, this is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. And I feel like that's where a lot of people's end times doctrines are. You've looked at it, you're troubled, you're pale, and you don't really know what to do with it. And that's where Daniel was stuck at. But here's the good news. That's not where we are. That's not the side of covenant that we're on. Daniel was, 400 or 500 years before Christ, quite a while before, the unfolding of what we're talking about. Had he been where we are now, he would not be troubled in thought. Maybe he'd be tan, even. I don't know. But he wouldn't feel like he needs to keep the matter to himself, because he would know that God has fulfilled something for his grand purposes, and he'd be excited about it. He wouldn't be shrinking back. He wouldn't feel defeated. He would be ready to go. And that's a lot of the big picture of what we're talking about, is that he has given us the victory. He's defeated the enemy. He wants us to walk victoriously. The more you can see that as the big picture for your life, the more that you realize the enemy's been defeated, the easier that's going to become. So just to bring you up to speed, if you haven't listened to the first couple weeks, we've gotten through the first 8 chapters of the book. Within that, you have this intro. John gets a vision. he sees Christ. Christ says, I want you to give a message to the 7 churches. He writes a message to the 7 churches. We get to see what that's all about. And then it shifts into some heavenly visions, starting with chapter 4. We see some of that heavenly scene. And then we get into, ultimately there's this scroll that's sealed up. And the scrolls are starting to be broken, open by the Lamb who was slain, who, of course, that's Christ. He's opening the seals. As he's opening the first 6 seals, which you could see this in chapter 6 of Revelation, you could see very clear connection to Jesus' Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24, as well as the parallel versions of it. And, you're seeing the wars and the famines and the plagues and these things that are unfolding as something is happening in the spiritual realm. There's some natural consequences to it for the Jewish people. And he gets to that 7th seal, and as he gets to the 7th seal, then we enter this scene of sounding of trumpets, which, of course, as we said, the trumpets kind of connect you to really just all the end of the age scriptures in the New Testament. So you have your big ones, if you don't know. You have your 1 Corinthians 15, your 1 Thessalonians 4, your Matthew 24 from Jesus himself, and then the book of Revelation. All of them discuss the sound of a trumpet, being indicative of we're at the end. And so, sometimes you have to realize that, like, okay, they're saying trumpets for a reason, and Jesus said trumpets for a reason, and Paul said trumpets for a reason, and when we're getting some of the details about it, like, it's not a mistake. And so anyway, the trumpets, they started to be sounded there in chapter 7 and 8, and you read descriptions of all these calamities of the ocean turning to blood, and there being hail that falls, and darkness that befalls the land, and different things. And it's like, it can all sound really scary and really terrible. And there undoubtedly was some really scary stuff that the people of this time would have faced. But also some of it is very symbolic, and some of it is just trying to tie you into, I tried to make this point quite a bit last week of, John is tying you into Old Testament events and language. He wants you to understand that, like, this is a Jewish thing, mostly. And that could be weird for us because we're not Jewish people. And so we miss out because we, haven't gone through the process of learning and the culture and all that. But, a lot of this it was to them, about them. It was talking about things to come. But anyway, so we had left off in at chapter 9, which was the 5th trumpet being sounded. And, a lot of you have obviously gathered or heard me say this enough, that when they talk about the end of the age, it was supposed to be on that generation of Jesus' audience. That generation of Pharisees, that generation of people. Those who pierced him will see him. Generation is 40 years. All the biblical background of that with the Exodus. It's all there, ripe for the taking. And so again, if we're using the puzzle analogy, like I've known about that for quite a while. The big picture of, yep, within 40 years there's going to be some cataclysmic events. We know the Jewish temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It checks the box. But when I would get into something like chapter 9, I would almost kind of have to just pick up my 70 AD rug and just sweep a bunch of stuff under it and be like, yeah, I'm not really sure exactly what this is, but I'm sure it fits in there somehow. And maybe someday I'll see Han Solo's belt buckle. And I think that I see it now. I think I can help you to see that this, certainly a surface level reading is not going to get it done for you. as we've said, you need to use biblical interpretation to get through this one. So when that fifth trumpet is sounded, you see that an angel has permission to open up the abyss. And out of this abyss, it describes these creatures that come up from the abyss. And it compares them to locusts, it compares them to scorpions, it compares them to horses, it compares them to lions. What is this thing? Is it insect? Is it cat? Is it? But anyway, it's got all kinds of descriptive languages about what's coming out of the abyss. And I think some of the tools to interpret this is, first of all, just check out where the word abyss appears in the New Testament. Super easy word to develop because it's only used like a handful of times. And it's actually only 2 times outside of the book of Revelation. Those 2 times, one is Luke chapter 8. Jesus sets foot on this ground. This crazy man comes running and screaming, who we later identify as Legion, a man who's demon-possessed. Demon-possessed man addresses Jesus, and he asks the question of, or really is begging Jesus, don't send us to the abyss yet. And he alludes to, it's not our time yet. And so they ask instead to go into the pigs. Jesus sends them into the pigs. The pigs go into the lake. They end up dying anyway. But that's clue number 1. So demons are associated with the abyss. And they themselves can identify like, oh, the abyss is a place that, grand scheme, that's kind of where we're at. Like that's where Jesus is planning for us to be. So that, I think, is a useful clue. The other interesting part is that Jesus himself is described as having, it says he who ascended had to descend, that is, to the abyss. And so that's Romans chapter 10, that same word. And so Jesus also was in the abyss, which AKA Hades, AKA Sheol. But Jesus had descended to this place. And so what I think is happening here, so remember, these are introduced as locust-like creatures. We've already seen the precedent from the previous chapter that John is using Exodus, Egypt plague language. And so locusts are a part of that. Locusts were one of the plagues, descended on the land, ate up all the crops. So he's still sticking with that theme, which is why he's choosing locusts. He's basically sticking with this theme of, hey, remember the bad guys in our history, Egypt, and how they were judged? You guys are the bad guys now, and you're facing judgment, and locusts are going to come get you. But this time, it's not about the actual bugs. It's, again, symbolic of what it all represents. The other element of it is, they have scorpion tails. And same deal. You can look up the word for scorpion elsewhere in the Greek. And Jesus in Luke chapter 10, when he gives authority to the 2 by 2, the 70, what's one of the things that is said? We have authority to trample snakes and scorpions. Snakes and scorpions, of course, are associated with, the enemy forces. And obviously the serpent part connects back to Genesis, but snakes and scorpions affiliated with the enemy, locusts affiliated with the plagues of Egypt, abyss associated with where, demons go and, kind of originate from. And so the idea that this angel is opening up the abyss and these things are coming out and causing all kinds of trouble, I think it's as simple in the word as this is fulfillment of the curses of disobedience that were promised to Israel. And I had mentioned this when Amy asked the question in the second week. Check out Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 15 till the end of the chapter, and Leviticus chapter 26, the heading would say, curses for disobedience. One of the things you'll see is you are going to go mad. And it goes through a whole list of activity that will associate that madness. I think what's happening here when the trumpets are being sounded, or this fifth trumpet's being sounded, is it's that invitation of the demonic realm to open at that particular time that's driving the Israelites to this national madness. And so that's part of what plunges them into so much trouble. And also, as bonus, this, again, sticking with the puzzle, I think it addresses a bit of a biblical riddle, if you want to call it that, which is, why can I read Colossians chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 2, 1 John chapter 3, and read that when Christ was crucified, the powers were disarmed, he made a public spectacle of the enemy, he's destroying the power of death, he's destroying the devil in 1 John chapter 3, not as a future thing, at that crucifixion, that's what he came to do. How can I read that the devil is destroyed, and yet I'm seeing that, seemingly demonic activity would be alive and well sometime after Christ was crucified? Why is that? And I really think that the word is trying to show us it's basically a prophetic mandate that this was going to happen to Israel and that they would fall into this trouble. And it actually helps you answer the question of what they are talking about in Revelation chapter 20, which is, it says the serpent's going to be loosed for a period of time. This is his loosing. This is his moment of playground activity where all of a sudden, as you read about the believer's role in all this, basically it says the best they can hope for is that they'll be preserved and not killed. But there's no indication of you're not going to go up to these problems, these forces, and lay your hands on them and deal with this issue. In other words, God, for this window of time specifically, God is restraining the ability for the believer to supersede the demonic activity, which is unique, but it would fit with the idea of, a temporary loosing of Satan. So hopefully that helps some. Obviously, there's more to say when we get to chapter 20. But yeah, the other part of that I think helps fill in this puzzle. So Matthew chapter 12, it talks about the idea of, first of all, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. And, you guys are saying, I cast out demons by the power source of the devil. But I'm telling you that can't be the true. I cast them out with the power of heaven, the kingdom of God. And then it gets into this thing of, if a demon is cast out, well, at first you can sweep the house clean and everything looks pretty good after that demon's out. But then sevenfold returns and the place is worse off than before, the first demon was cast out, because the sevenfold issue. That sevenfold thing comes right out of the curses of disobedience in Leviticus chapter 26. It actually says you're going to face 7 times consequences. And so I don't think Jesus was arbitrary in that. And I think that that's exactly what is being introduced in the lead up to the destruction of the temple. It's that, hey, Jesus came, he's starting to take authority, spiritual authority, he's disarming the devil, he's casting out demons, he's cleaning up Israel, he's opening a way for the Gentiles. Things are looking pretty good. Oh, trumpet number 5 just sounded. Things are looking really bad. Way worse than before Jesus came, because now, we're trapped with this enormous demonic force who is apparently driving us into national madness so that we're going to eat our children, to quote Mike Tyson. but also the Bible, because the Bible said it first. So I'll give you a dramatic pause, let that sink in. But yeah, I really think that helps account for the trouble they faced, the words of Jesus. How did he defeat the devil? And yet it seems like there's a period of time that there's wild demonic activity. I think it helps answer and frame some of that up. And, I don't know. I found it very helpful personally. So you get into, where are we? The sixth angel. So he sounds his trumpet. I think this is another kind of popular thing that comes up. Talks about, these angels at the Euphrates River. All of a sudden, the doors open. My English translation says 200 million mounted troops are coming through. And it's like, people who read that literally, they're like, well, clearly China, obviously. Like, there's not 200 million people at, some point in the past that could have that kind of army. But yeah, again, as I've said before, when you come up against a number in the book of Revelation, never give it the literal number. Always look at the affiliation and the association. And so the word in the Greek is, it's what we would derive our word of myriad. That's the Greek word. It's like myrias. And where that would tie in to Old Testament is Psalm chapter 68. It refers to there being a myriad of chariots associated with God. And so the idea here is that when that Euphrates is opened up, God is allowing for this immense myriad of spiritual activity to overtake the promised land. And the reason I say overtake the promised land, that's kind of the key deal with the Euphrates River. So like, if you remember in Genesis, Eden had 4 rivers, right? And the Euphrates is one of them. And the Euphrates is that's one that stays throughout the Old Testament. So right in Genesis chapter 15, Abraham gets a promise. This is going to be the piece of property that you get. One of those borders is the Euphrates River. So the Euphrates River represents a border of safety. You think about it, like a big fat river doesn't just let people walk across it. So that means it protects you. And like he has his piece of property, Israel, hemmed in with, Red Seas and Mediterranean Seas and Euphrates rivers. And so the idea is it's supposed to be a protected place. And it's even somewhat affiliated with Eden in the sense that the river is affiliated there. The idea of all of a sudden I'm going to let something cross the Euphrates to come get you, it's God saying, hey, that supernatural blessing that I had been giving you for obedience, I'm now withdrawing it. And so the protection that you had or thought you had, that's not a thing for this moment in time. And so again, I don't think it's so much, I go a little bit back and forth on this, but I certainly don't think it was about 200 million literal troops. It was a spiritual thing that God is opening up. Now, that said, actual troops are involved with the ransacking of Jerusalem. And so in some elements, there's a physical component to this that's actually happening, and there's a spiritual backdrop to it that's motivating it and causing it to happen. And that's a big part that you have to keep in balance, is that Israel's that physical place with physical prosperity or physical judgment. And so they are facing some actual, tangible earthly consequences. But at the same time as that's happening, there's immense spiritual activity that's behind it all. And that's the part that interests us, because if you're on the new covenant end of it, You're not worried about the spiritual judgment side of it. You're worried about where does this leave me on the other side of it, which we're actually about to see in chapter 10. Nate only gave me 2 chapters. I don't know if that was a bet or what. No, we're doing great. Chapter 10 is so small. But yeah, the end. So even the end of chapter 9 there, it does say they did not stop worshiping demons and idols. Well, maybe that answered the question of what was going on. They did not stop worshiping demons. I made this whole complicated explanation, but maybe it's as simple as that. So they didn't stop worshiping demons and idols of gold, silver, bronze, stone, and wood, idols that cannot see or hear or walk, nor did they repent of their murders, their magic arts, their sexual immorality, or their thefts. That idea of idols that cannot see, hear, or walk, it's a direct reference to Psalm 115, Psalm 135. Both of those describe idols that have mouths but can't speak, eyes but can't see, ears but can't hear. And so it's, again, John, he's stabbing the knife and he's twisting it. I would not want to be roasted by John. He was like a spiritually inspired roaster of Israel. And, you know, he had all the throwbacks, all the language, and like, yeah, he's just pressing that button on these guys. But yeah, so getting into chapter 10, I'm not going to say much about it except for verse 7. Well, verse 6 going into verse 7. It says, there will be no more delay, but in the days when the 7th angel is about to sound his trumpet, the mystery of God will be accomplished, just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. And you might be like, oh, a mystery, great, more mysteries. But no, this is a mystery that's very easily solved and interpreted. Just go back and look at the use of that word mystery, and you'll pretty easily mine it out. I'll give you, maybe 4 or 5 main components of it. 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We won't all sleep, but we're all going to be changed. And that is a key detail to remember. But when they say sleep, they're not talking about dying. Or I'm sorry, when they're saying sleep, they're talking about dying. And so like in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is stoned, he falls asleep. Well, did he actually fall asleep? No, he got his head bashed in with rocks and he died. But they call it sleep because his spirit was asleep, waiting for what we're looking at in this. So Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is addressing that same issue, which is, hey, there's some of us who are asleep in the Lord, died in faith, in other words, like Stephen the martyr. And there's other people who are we're alive. We believe and we're alive. We haven't died yet. Well, behold, you don't need to fall asleep to experience the change. And I would propose every single one of us in this room, the moment we had faith in Christ, there was a change. And that change, back then, between Christ and 30 AD, when he was resurrected, and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, for that 40-year window, they had a unique situation. It was as our esteemed apostle has coined it, it's the overlap of 2 covenants. It's exactly what it is. You can't really say it better than that. During that window of time, you could have faith, but still fall asleep, not having experienced the fullness of all of this. But when that destruction of the temple occurred, when the old covenant was closed and the new was consummated, at that moment, when you had faith, or anyone else who has faith from then on, you don't need to sleep, but you will be changed. which tells you a lot because I'd say all of you sitting in this room have been changed, and yet there's not necessarily, let's say at the end of this meeting, I don't know if there's any candidates for this, but if you're like, I'm a first-time responder to the call of God in my life, I believe, then something would change for you, but it's not like anyone could look at you and say, oh yeah, he's changed. Because the change occurred in your spirit, and that's the key. Another point of the mystery is that, I guess related to that, well, the mystery is Christ in you. The hope of glory. So Christ indwelling in you is a part of the mystery. The other part of the mystery is that he's made a new creation, a new type of person out of Jews and Gentiles, doesn't matter which. That's a part of the mystery, that the Jews and Gentiles alike are both part of new creation. And then in Ephesians chapter 5, it compares the marriage of a man and a woman to Christ and the church, that is a mystery, which is a perfect, element to all this, because in the later chapters of Revelation, you're going to see, wedding is definitely a part of this whole situation in the book of Revelation. But yeah, so anyway, the mystery was, as these seals are broken, the trumpets are being sounded, no more delay, the mystery is being accomplished. If you don't think that mystery's been accomplished, when you die, I hope you're ready to be asleep, because that's where you are scripturally. Which, I mean, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But why in your head falsely prepare for that when the change could be right now? And then it could motivate everything else in your life today. All right. So that's chapter 10. There's a bunch of other stuff there too, but two chapters. Oh, we're going for 6, so so chapter 11. So I was given a reed like a measuring rod and told, go and measure the temple of God and the altar, count the worshipers there, but exclude the outer court, don't measure it. It's been given to the Gentiles. Two comments on that. One, we haven't really discussed this debate about when this book was written. Some would say that this book was written in 90-something AD, which would blow everything I'm saying to smithereens. It just wouldn't really make a lot of sense. Obviously, another camp would say, no, it wasn't written in the 90s. It was written pre-70 AD, and it would fit the narrative that I'm talking about perfectly. Just a proposal. It's not conclusive in itself, but imagine if the temple had just been destroyed, like the actual Jewish temple had just been destroyed, and God is telling John in a spiritual vision, go measure the temple. It's a little bit weird. It's kind of like, it'd be like if your relative died and you just started somebody was talking about them and they just had died. Nobody wants that. That's inappropriate. That's really good. So I don't, again, it doesn't finish anything, but it's just a thought. That said, I'm going to rebut that thought by saying it ties into, the language itself ties into Ezekiel 41 to 44. It's this exact deal of go measure the temple, check out the gates, all that kind of stuff. And Ezekiel also was dealing with, temple destructions and things like that too. So again, it's not conclusive, but it's just something to have in the tool belt. So they get into, Here's a good one. Verse 3, I'll give my power to my 2 witnesses. They'll prophesy for 1,260 days. Everybody wants to know who were the 2 witnesses. They must have been so cool. Like, I want to know who they are. What's their identity? Bill, will you reveal their identity to me? And it's so anticlimactic. I think you could somewhat fill in a John the Baptist Jesus type combo here, and that would be somewhat legitimate. But at a bigger scale, knowing what John is all about with his Old Testament, he's just talking about the law and the prophets are the 2 witnesses. And the reason why it's the 2 witnesses, that's just a biblical principle. An accusation doesn't hold up unless there's 2 or more witnesses. You can't, in the New Testament, don't receive an accusation against an elder unless there's 2 or more witnesses. Don't forget it. If it's just one of you, it's no good. So it's the law and the prophets. We saw that with Jesus, with the transfiguration. He has Moses appears, Elijah appears. It's that witness to what's happening in the last times. They're the 2 witnesses. It's not 2 actual people who we're necessarily concerned about here. The 1,260 days part, which previous verse had mentioned it as 42 months, which is just the same thing. And 3.5 would be the other conversion. So 3.5 years times 12 is 42 months, times 30 is 1,260. But again, the numbers aren't really the relevant part. It's where it ties you into, which, again, it actually ties you right into, he's talking about the 2 witnesses being the law and the prophets. So the prophet, Elijah, it says that, and actually James paraphrases this in chapter 5, but rain was stopped up for 3.5 years. And so it's that in-between kind of situation of like, hey, I know I'm representing God. I know I'm your prophet, God, but things are pretty rough and bleak right now for me. And now it's not raining, it's not raining for 3.5 years on the land and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of one tip of the hat towards Elijah's situation. The 1260 also ties into Daniel, 3 different places. So Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 12. And all 3 of them are really, really important to understanding the book of Revelation, because chapter 7, it talks about these beasts that come up out of the ocean, and it's 4 of them, and they represent 4 kingdoms, and, it kind of describes details about each one of them. But ultimately, the 4th one, who seems very ferocious, for as ferocious as it is, it's displaced. What is it displaced by? Kingdom of God. So God has, this is thematically it's important. God has an everlasting kingdom that dominates any earthly kingdom. And it doesn't matter how powerful that 4th kingdom appeared, the kingdom of heaven is an everlasting kingdom that dominates any worldly natural kingdom. That's Daniel chapter 7, what he was looking forward to, which I would say at the time of John writing Revelation, he's now in the thick of that transition from 4th kingdom to everlasting heavenly kingdom. And I'll have more explanation on that in a minute. Daniel chapter 9, which is the other tie into these numbers that they're giving, Same kind of idea. There's a prophetic word. There's this promise that, after this period of time, there's going to be a moment when I might not get all 5 or 6 of them, but sin will be atoned for, transgressions will be dealt with, the sacrifice will be not needed anymore, and everlasting righteousness will be available. And that's the gist of the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy in chapter 9. Well, exactly. That's what Christ was doing, was he was transitioning from their natural system of sacrificing and atoning for sin and wickedness and transgression. He's removing the need for all that by one flawless sacrifice, one time that represents all time, past and present and future, and it brings in everlasting righteousness because, well, we're not dependent on righteousness by the law anymore. We're dependent on righteousness through faith in Christ. And so Christ is the one who is bringing in the heavenly kingdom that trumps all other earthly kingdoms. Christ is the one who fulfills that prophetic word of Daniel chapter 9. And lastly, again, we're tying into why did John use the numbers that he used. Chapter 12 uses, these numbers too, as well. And chapter 12 is about many will be in the dust, asleep. And at this moment in time, some will be raised to everlasting righteousness, and some will be left to everlasting contempt. And those who raise from the dust for everlasting righteousness, they will shine like the brightness of the morning sun. And that's obviously addressing the issue of kind of what we were already talking about, which is some are falling asleep in the faith, some are going to be changed before they fall asleep, but ultimately there's going to be a judgment of the dead. And that's what Daniel chapter 12 was talking about, and that is also, we're going to see, we're right in the thick of all these things in Revelation. It's not an accident. He's trying to put you into these frameworks so that you can see what we're talking about. But if you're stuck on, I need to know who Superman is or who Batman is as these two unidentified, you miss the whole point of what we're talking about. It's not about somebody's secret identity. It's about the law and the prophets stand as witness to everything that's unfolding here, and it's also fulfilling all these prophetic words of Daniel. Now, the key with Daniel, remember, he became that pale, how was he described? Trembling and pale. I don't want to be trembling and pale. He also was told, basically set this aside. You could read it at the end of chapter 12. Set it aside because this is still far off in your future. It's still sealed up. And isn't that interesting? It was sealed up for Daniel. We're right in the middle of the whole thing being open right now. Remember, that's the whole subject matter starting with chapter 6. Let's open up this scroll and get inside of it. So what was withheld for Daniel is now actively being opened for the audience of this. And so, that's really important. That's a big difference. The mystery was being unveiled. The mystery was being revealed. Again, with the symbolic language, so verse 8, it talks about their bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. That is, again, John is the master at roasting Israel. Because he's saying, hey, you're Sodom and Egypt. Yeah, where the Lord was crucified. Where'd the Lord get crucified? Right in Jerusalem, which is the capital city of the place we're talking about here that's getting judged. So he's intentionally comparing them to their historical opposition. And he's trying to make them see, hey, you have now shifted to the villains of this story. And, like we saw in chapter 9, there's arguably opportunity to shift, but they're actively choosing to worship demons, false idols that can't speak, that can't talk, that can't walk. And so it's a choice. Tying this into, there's definitely a sprinkling of, alluding to John the Baptist and Jesus. Verse 10 kind of has that feel. So the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending each other gifts. If you remember, I don't remember, but hopefully you can figure it out and remember, there's a scripture in the Gospels that talks about the interaction between Pontius Pilate and Herod. And it says that they were previously enemies and estranged, but through the crucifixion of Christ, they'd actually gained some common friendship. And from that day forward, they were allies, basically. And that also was a tipping point for all this, which is, and we're going to see a lot of it in chapter 13, there became this kind of unholy alliance between the natural kingdom of Rome and the false religious system of Judaism at the time. And they had a link that, was adulterous, essentially. It was, breaking covenant with God for the sake of grasping hold of power. And, the irony there is, of course, Rome ends up, overtaking and slaughtering the Jews. But the lead up to all that is they're a unified force in punishing the believers. You often see that appeal of it'll say some Jewish rabble-rouser saw what was going on. They didn't like what they saw. And they said, hey, let's get the Roman authorities here to arrest these guys. Let's deal with them. And it was that type of thing of together, we're going to work together to oppress the believers. Of course, that unravels for the Jews, by the end of this. But we're kind of in as you could tell, I have like a loose plan. I've read the book before, but it's not we're on railroad tracks of we have to talk about this verse this time. But that's part of the fun of all this to me, is that you could pick almost any verse you want and we can go on a little discourse about it. Yeah, so verse 13 is kind of interesting just because the number there, again, it's interesting. It says 7,000 people were killed in an earthquake. And again, you might think wow, all right, that's a lot of people for an earthquake. What was going on? But nope, wrong idea. We're not fixated on a literal number. I almost could care less about the literal number. 7,000 is the throwback to Elijah. He thought he was alone. Turns out God had preserved, this 7,000 remnant of faithful people still. Now we have the counterbalance to that of, in the way that there was a faithful remnant that was preserved, now we have a 7,000 destruction that it's an equal and opposite reaction, which I repeat myself 100 times a day with this stuff, but it almost can't be overstated that the two-sided scroll was two-sided because there's a blessing side to it and a curse side to it. And so when we see an equal opposite reaction, it's not surprising, it's almost expected. So we get through a couple statements in chapter 11 that I think is good to know. So verse 18, it says, your wrath has come, the time has come for judging the dead and for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your saints and those who reverence your name. So yeah, I said this ties into Daniel chapter 12. There was going to be a time for judging the dead, righteous and unrighteous. They're proposing that at the breaking of these seals, the sounding of these trumpets, that's when that moment was coming. And I'll say it 100 times, I'll say it 100 more. Jesus was speaking to his generation. And the word, I haven't said this yet, but the word that he used for tribulation in Matthew 24 is the exact same Greek word that's used for tribulation in Revelation chapter 7. They're talking about the same thing. There's, don't separate them because they belong together. So yeah, judging the dead, that's a big moment. And an also very big moment is verse 19, which is God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the ark of his covenant. The big deal there is, remember, equal and opposite reaction. Jewish physical temple being destroyed, at the same time, opening of heavenly temple for the righteous to dwell in. God is no longer concerned with houses and temples built with natural hands. He's interested in inviting us to a spiritual place. And we are the temple of the Spirit, and yet we're also cumulatively blocks that make up a temple for him. But in any case, he's given us access to this heavenly temple at this moment of time, which is associated with judgment of the dead, tied into the Great Tribulation, the opening of all these seals, sounding of all these trumpets, was supposed to happen within the generation. What? Oh my gosh. I thought those were short chapters too. All right, 10 more minutes, right? Good? Mark doesn't care. Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is something that it makes it very clear that this book doesn't even necessarily progress chronologically. It obviously is not progressing chronologically, because if you read the first few sentences of chapter 12, it's talking about a pregnant woman crying out in pain who's about to give birth, and a dragon who's wanting to devour the child the moment it was born. But she did give birth to a son, and he's going to rule with an iron scepter. They're talking about the birth of Jesus. And if you remember, the whole deal was, let's kill all the toddlers 2 and under so that we get him before he grows up and fulfills his mission. There was no dragon who was eating the babies. The dragon inspired a man named Herod to kill a bunch of children. And no different than Moses with Pharaoh. You actually see reference to even that, because again, it's symbolic language, so it can mean multiple things at once. But in verse 15, it says, from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman, sweep away her with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman, swallowed up the river. So if you remember how Pharaoh killed the toddlers in his day, he was throwing them in the river, in the Nile River, to either drown or be eaten or whatever. And Moses was preserved and, taken out of the river. The dragon is obviously a sick, twisted creature who inspires people to do sick, twisted things. And the more power you have, if he gets a hold of you, the more twisted and crazy things that they could do back then. And so that's what they did. But the important part to realize is that when we're in chapter 12, this is not a chronological fit to everything else we just read. And so, as I mentioned in the first week, this is a time where we end up, we get some new information and some new angles, but we're not getting a whole brand new story. We're just getting other angles of the same information in the same story. So like, we just got a heavenly temple being opened. I'd propose in some of these later chapters, we're just seeing, well, now we're not looking at heavenly temple, we're looking at marriage. Or we're looking at getting back to Eden. Or, so there, but anyway, point is, it's not chronological. This is the birth of Jesus being described here. And I think that that's worth noting. Well, that was 2 or 3 minutes. The thing is, I know we've talked some about chapter 12. And so it's not that I don't think that it's like interesting or useful. I just kind of want to hit things that maybe we haven't spoken of in detail. So chapter 13. So you have, I guess the last verse of 12, it says that the dragon, it is 13. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. And he had 10 horns, 7 heads, 10 crowns on his horns, and each had a blasphemous name. And like I said, so that's Daniel chapter 7. This is not some new vision of John. This is just Daniel chapter 7 repackaged by John, almost down to the the heads and the horns and all that stuff. And it coming out of the sea. And so, again, immediately, if your inclination is, I'm looking for natural fulfillment, I'm looking for sea monsters, I'm looking for, that kind of thing, you're so far out of bounds of what we're talking about. You have to get back to the scripture to interpret it. And so Daniel 7, when we saw beasts in the sea, we're talking about Gentile kingdoms rising up in power, trying to dominate God's people, and ultimately those kingdoms being dominated by God's everlasting kingdom. And that's exactly the same thing that we're seeing here, just with some extra detail about it. And, so it's all the typical stuff. He's boastful. He's got the blasphemous names. It's what kings do, right? It's the Nebuchadnezzar type way of like, I'm going to make this 90-foot statue and you're going to worship me because I'm so great. Like that was the king thing to do. That was like the Babylonian thing to do. That's the Pharaoh thing to do. Well, it's the Roman thing to do as well. Don't worship God. Worship what I've created as a man. And of course, it's all wrong. Divine right to rule and all that, that was built right into the package. I know I've mentioned this at some point in a sermon about, again, you can get lost in the details of, well, what about this stuff about him getting like a fatal wound to the head and, how does that work? Like, if we're not talking about an actual, like, knight slaying a dragon, if we're talking about symbolic things, what is that? Well, you could read in Philippians, Paul, he says, send my greetings to all the brethren, including those of the house of Caesar. And so the idea is that despite the beast's desire to be supreme and, like, speak his blasphemous ways against God, even in that, God has a way to reach the heart of people, including Caesar's own household, which is completely undermining the whole thing. They don't want to call Christ king. They hate the idea of Christ being king. And so the idea that the actual household that's calling themselves king and divine right to rule, that they're calling on the name of Christ, it's a wound. It's a head wound. And what I like about this, and this is what we always do, we're just using scripture to try to interpret what's being said here. Paul made that statement of send my greetings to the brothers, including those in Caesar's household. We didn't have to pull some, extraneous source to try to make the case. It's right in the scripture trying to point you into different things that you could use to understand this. So he gets into the secondary beast in verse 11. And he says that this one is like a lamb, but he speaks like the dragon. It's, as I guess I've called it, it's that false religious system. Looks like the lamb as in it's somewhat resembling Christ and covenant people and, whatever's going on with all of that. But its inspiration and its voice is actually from this other beast who actually derives his voice from the serpent, the dragon. And so it's this counterfeit hierarchy of dragon, natural kingdoms, false religious systems is what we're seeing in chapter 13. And it's like in direct opposition to, God, and he doesn't empower a natural kingdom, he empowers his son Christ, and then he uses that to empower the church, the true religious system, if you want to call it that. And so there's these two, opposing things. But yeah, he looks like the lamb, speaks like a dragon. Even has some signs and wonders, which you see allusion to that in the book of Acts too, of there's times where different guys would take people out to the desert and they'd be like, oh, wow, maybe this one's the Christ. And they'd have hundreds of followers. Well, it's not because they were doing nothing. Something was happening. But I would say it was probably more akin to like remember the judgment of Egypt. The magicians and sorcerers, to a point, they replicated something. They had something to try to back up their authority. It's just it was not as powerful as what God had. And eventually it wasn't, it couldn't compete with it ultimately. And so I think that there's some of that, that you're being steered into with this as well. The counterfeit. And it was the same actually for Daniel too of when it was time to interpret that dream, they're bringing in all their guys. Let's figure this dream out. Let's interpret this dream. They can't do it. Okay, now bring in the covenant people. They'll be able to do it. Okay, so chapter 14, 5 minutes. This introductory paragraph, remember, chapter 12 is that pivot point. We're not in chronological order. We're back to the 144,000, which we saw in chapter 7. We're back to the harpists, and new song, which is chapter 5. We're back to the 4 living creatures, which is chapter 4. And so it's all very similar. The name is written on their foreheads. This idea of being marked, which was a previous chapter. They're restating a lot of things that we've already seen. But this time, the conclusion in verses 14 to 20, in my Bible, it's titled The Harvest of the Earth. But you have this whole thing of, angels are sent out with a sickle, and it's time to reap. They're reaping. The earth is ripe. Let's harvest. The angel swung a sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city. Blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horse's bridle. for a distance of 1,600 stadia. But yeah, verse 16, it gets into the earth was harvested. All of that should ring a bell, because if you remember, Matthew chapter 13 has a whole thing about the harvest. And it's talking about how, there's wheat and there's tares. Tares are, going to get destroyed. The wheat will be preserved. This time we're talking about, grapes instead of wheat and tares, but it's that same type of harvest, right down to the idea that, angels are the ones who are doing it. And if you're like, oh, well, maybe, I know the temptation is, maybe this is talking about something else, a different event, a different moment. The biggest problem with that is Matthew chapter 13. It says it right in verse 39. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. It's not ambiguous at all. And so if you're somebody who concludes like, oh yeah, the end of the age, same thing he's talking about in Matthew 24, it's on this generation, that tribulation that Jesus talks about carries over to Revelation, you don't really have wiggle room to start calling it something else. It's all the same thing. And interestingly, even in this parable, Jesus' conclusion is, then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. Daniel chapter 12, which we've already discussed and explained a bit. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, close up the seals of the word of the scroll until the time of the end. Jesus, how unoriginal. You stole Daniel's exact words. And then John, you're even less original because you stole both of their words. I hope, again, if we're looking at the back of the puzzle box to look at the picture, I hope you're starting to see there's one big picture and it all fits together. And maybe you don't have every single piece yet, but the more I stare at it and the more I look at the individual pieces, the more I realize they're all a perfect fit. It's Han Solo's belt buckle. And yeah, I guess the kids are back, so we don't need to talk about the bloody wine press. Though it is a good one to talk about of why that language. But I'll leave you with a positive one. So Revelation 14, remember, victory. Verse 13, right. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. From now on. That is the key to what we're talking about is when I die, when you die, when we shed this natural flesh, the change has already happened. There's no wait. There's no sleep. The dead are blessed from this point forward. All right. That's it for me. Nate?
All right. I was thinking real quick, and it's only because I sat through 2 years of this, so I don't have to pay a ton of attention. But I got stuck on the thought of, can you imagine what the conversation was like for Daniel and Ezekiel and John when they all got together and they're comparing notes and they're like, man, I saw this. And John's like, I saw it 2 times that, and I got to live it. That to me is a wild conversation that they probably had. For me, I was telling Bill this the other night, not the Han Solo belt buckle, but more of once you start putting the puzzle together and you start seeing, oh man, this looks exactly like the box that I'm building. There's that moment in that puzzle, right? Where the last like 30 pieces start flying in, right? You guys have done puzzles before? They start flying in. Once you get to that moment, I'll tell you the moment for me, and I'm glad that you kind of touched on it quick because I don't want to jump ahead to the end of Revelation. But Daniel was given a vision. It took up four chapters of his book all about this, and he kind of alluded to it. God told him at the end of that vision, you're keeping this basically to yourself. Seal it up. It's not even close to my time, right? And Daniel's 600 years before this. And then John gets a vision, right? So we're 2026 years from John, and John gets a vision, and he's not told to seal it up. This isn't that time. He's told, this is it. Like, the time is right now. This is what this is for. Don't seal it up. So for me, that was when all of a sudden that puzzle started looking exactly like the picture that I saw, and the rest of the stuff kind of just filled in neatly and kind of completed it all. So.
Your goodness is